Hi, we continue in Revelation 20 today as Satan is released from prison only to be thrown into the lake of fire. Not a good day for Satan, aka the devil, later in our little passage. So, we're going to be looking at this as we've been doing in light of both the Hebrew scripture echoes that you can see on the right side of the screen and the larger picture of how John is following, although changing the pattern of the end part of Ezekiel here, as we've seen, where the Gog and Magog part here are taken from. So, we'll be looking at that, and we'll also be looking at how the work of Shane Wood that we saw in the video before the Zoroastrian one on Revelation 21-6 and the question of the millennium reveals a parody of the Roman triumph. That Satan being released from prison and then marching up and then being killed is or at least not killed, at least put in the lake of fire where he's tormented, is a parody of the Roman triumph. So thanks to Shane Wood for that work. So we've been looking through the questions in Revelation 19 and 20, and we've gotten up through these so far. So now we're going to be looking at this question, which we began to look at last time. We looked at this, and now we're going to be looking a little bit at Gog and Magog. We'll get to the books and those not written in the book next time. We're also looking now at the second part of these parallel passages. So we saw from 19:19 to 20 verse 4, this four-part pattern that we see repeated here of gathering for battle, being captured or destroyed, thrown to the lake of fire and sulfur, and then a throne vision. So now we're on the second half of that paralleling this. And in the first one, as we saw, the beast and the false prophet were captured and sent into the lake of fire, and now the devil. And we're reminded there that the false prophet and the beast had already been put there, so making that connection. So as we look at Hebrew scripture references that are echoed here, in addition to Ezekiel as part of the big picture, we're also seeing elements from Isaiah and from Genesis and Habakkuk and Sirach, and from the beginning of Second Kings, as well as from apocalyptic non-canonical literature like First Enoch. So John is really drawing from all of Scripture here. It's really amazing what a range it is, from the Torah to the prophets to the apocalyptic material outside the Bible to illustrate his scene. So our passage 7 to 10, it forms a nice tight little chiasm. So you can see that on the screen here. It begins with Satan released from prison and ends as the devil, but we already know from earlier in the chapter that those are the same, returned to prison. And we see that the rising and falling action really so quickly. This great gather for battle with an army as numerous as sands of the sea, and in part of a verse, fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and that was that. So God's power making mincemeat out of Satan's gathering of armies from the nations. So as I won't go back over this when the 1,000 years are ended. We talked about that last time, and so you can watch that video if you'd like. Satan as a specific entity is referenced in these various times. It's in 12:9 and 20 verse 2 that Satan is equated with the devil and the serpent, as we saw earlier. So he'll be released from his prison, literally loosened. Auni notes, according to a widespread ancient tradition, demons released from the place of their confinement are much more dangerous than they were before. And we hear that echoed in Luke's gospel. We hear that a woman who had 7 demons cast out or had a demon cast out, and it went wandering, and it returned and brought more and made it even worse than it was in the first place. So we see that tradition there. Be released from prison. Earlier we saw it as the abyss, but now the functional nature of the abyss is named. It was also the source of Satan. We saw back in chapter 9, the beast arose from the abyss, so it seemed like it was their home, but now with it being shut and covered over, it's become a prison. And after being released higher, Satan will come out to deceive the nations. And you note the parallel here from 4th Ezra, which you can see on the screen. Come out to deceive the nations. And as we've been highlighting throughout this section, we saw it in verse 23 as part of the parallel of these scenes here. That's the very nature of Satan, the devil here, is to be the expression of the very imperial propaganda that would suggest that the empire is doing the will of the gods rather than the followers of Jesus. So he'll come out to deceive the nations. At one level, the nations seemed like they were already destroyed in 1921, but this is not chronological, as we've been seeing. 2 different angles on a parallel situation. As Olul notes below, the nations, as named here, are those who wish to destroy Israel and the church and Jerusalem, which is to say those who don't side with the Lamb. We have this interesting phrase, 4 corners of the earth here. It's taken from Isaiah, as you can see on my parallels over there. And it's found a couple of other places. I won't speculate on what it meant about how they thought there was a flat earth that had corners. They obviously wouldn't have known in the ways that we can know, but perhaps it's just meant to be poetic. But it's to say they're gathering from everywhere, from this great plain, and gathering into this place Gog and Magog. And this is plainly just a tagline to note that these names are mentioned there, because as my note below says, in Sumerian, and the language that Ezekiel would be dealing with in the context of exile in Babylon, although Akkadian would have been the current language, the ancient language would have been Sumerian. Although Gog means darkness and Magog means the land of God, which is Gog, which is the land of darkness. And the Sibylline oracles in apocalyptic tradition roughly contemporaneous with Revelation, Gog and Magog are taken to be black. Not the people there, but the places are. Blenkinsop notes it in the Targum, which is to say the Aramaic versions of the original Hebrew text on Ezekiel 38 to 39, where there's also some commentary that identifies Gog with Rome and Magog with the Roman emperor. So perhaps John has that in mind, or he knows that audience might have that in mind, but it's also a direct echo from Ezekiel, where it was Gog of the land of Magog there. And it's described in Ezekiel in a long battle here. We can see some of that here in this scene where there's this long set of details here, some of which we saw in chapter 19. But here John's making the point that this gigantic army is nothing compared to the power of God. And so we also saw this connecting with chapter 19 and the question of the feast that the birds will eat. So Gog and Magog evoking the Ezekiel background in order to gather them for battle, or literally for war. It's the same word that we saw for war earlier, so no distinction there. Numerous are the sands of the sea, which is terribly ironic, as we see in the parallels here. As numerous as the sands of the sea was an expression of God's promise of fertility to Jacob, that your offspring will be as numerous as the sands of the sea. And here the enemy army is as numerous as the sands of the sea here. Sands is actually singular here, the sand of the sea, and it's only here in Revelation, although we did hear about the seashore where the beast took up its stand. They marched up over the breadth of the earth here, and all very quickly marching up, paralleling the fire coming down. The phrase breadth of the earth, platos, is contrasted with 21:16. Let's look at it there as we can see. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, etc. And so that's New Jerusalem. So New Jerusalem is contrasted here with the breadth of the earth that the enemy army gathers around. And they surround the camp of the saints. That's an image that might suggest something from the battle scenes in First Maccabees. The phrase for camp of the saints, parambolin, is a military phrase. Giblin notes it is used in Hebrews. Shane Wood suggests barracks, and it has 3 related meanings, as you can see down below: as a fortified army camp, as a temporary encampment, i.e., namely in tents, or as an army or armies. But as Wood notes, it also highlights the image of the triumph, that the returning soldiers from the army there would be ready to celebrate their victory by seeing the enemy king paraded before the emperor in the triumph parade. So they surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Is this the New Jerusalem or not? Well, in Sirach 24, you can see, in the beloved city, likewise, he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem was my dominion. And the norms of Hebrew byline poetry suggest that the beloved city in the first line is parallel to Jerusalem in the second line. But here, New Jerusalem will only come down out of heaven in chapter 21, so it's not made visible yet. But otherwise, we don't know anything about beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them just like that, plainly evoking the echo of Elijah, who was challenged by the king after Ahab there to show that he was a man of God, and he challenged the priests of the king to make fire come down and burn the wet log, and they couldn't do it, but he could do it. And sure enough, fire came down and consumed them, almost verbatim from 2 Kings. And finally, we get to the devil who would deceive them. Notice that shapes the chiasm here, throne, and that highlights the sequence that we saw earlier, and also echoes here from First Enoch. And on the day of the great judgment, he, Azazel, shall be cast into the fire. In that context, the narrative context of the flood, but John's not worrying about those details here. The image of being thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, as we already saw from 1920 here, where the beast and the false prophet were. and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And that's where I want to pause as we come to an end of this. To be tormented here, the verb is reversing what we saw in 9:5, but I want to go back to 11:10 to highlight what this might mean. So here, after the witnesses to the Lamb testify in the street of the great city and are killed, the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. In other words, the torment or torture was speaking the truth to people who don't want to hear it. And I'd like to suggest that that's the divine karma, if you will, that's happening here. That the false prophet and the beast and the devil are not being killed. They're being tormented with the truth, with the recognition that empire is a lie, that God is on the side of empire is a lie, and they knew it, and they're going to be tormented with this truth day and night forever and ever. And so from this classic image, you see how the battle is portrayed, and it's portrayed with the sword there, but the sword is from the mouth, and there is no actual physical battle to be portrayed there. So we'll come to the very end of chapter 20 with the last judgment, and we'll evoke Michelangelo for that. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.